Hi everybody, I'm Ryan. Today we're going to talk about all of the new mechanics released this year in Magic the Gathering as a celebration for the end of the year. Besides the Infinity mechanics, which I'm going to ignore because they're not real, there were 16 new mechanics released in Magic the Gathering this year. We're going to start with what I would consider the worst mechanics release and move on to the best mechanics released. I'm going to explain the mechanic and why I think it's in the position that it is. Here we go. The worst mechanic I think released this year is the stun counter. So stun counter, basically there's some cards that put stun counters on creatures, and at the beginning of people's turns, instead of untapping, you remove a stun counter from that permanent. And I think this mechanic kind of sucks for a couple different reasons. One, you're rarely ever going to play a card, really even in limited, that is just about tapping something down and it can untap next turn. Now, there have been cards in the past where, is a tap something down, they can untap, and it has flashback. That's, reasonable in hyper-aggressive decks. But normally they were played as sideboard cards or, just a few cards in the deck. And this is also way before, insane power creep. I never cared about stun counters in my deck, especially something that, just tapped something down and gave a stun counter. Now, I will say it is a neat way to, mark that something can't untap. And that's probably why they did this. But as a mechanic, In 15th, I have Alliance, which originally got released in New Capenna. Alliance says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, this happens to your creatures. Now, this mechanic could end up being really good, but I think they were very reserved with this mechanic. There isn't really any Alliance creatures that I want to be casting. And I think there's a really difficult line that Wizards has to live with the Alliance mechanic, where you can make it very powerful or you can make it awful. And the Alliance creatures that were released were pretty bad. I think they need to ramp up the mechanic in order for it to be good, need to be a little more liberal with the mechanic, and make the when a creature enters the battlefield do way more powerful things in order for it to actually be considered a good mechanic. Alliance does have potential, though. The cards they released with Alliance, meh. And the issue is with those difficult mechanics that ride a line that it's really hard to find a good medium. They're either awful or just actually broken. It's really tough. The 14th is Backgrounds, which originally got released with Baldur's Gate. So this is a EDH only mechanic, and I don't play a ton of EDH. But some commanders were released with the ability to choose a background. Backgrounds were legendary enchantments that did something. And basically, if you're able to choose a background, it changed the color identity of your commander into having multiple color identities, the commander's original color and the background. And this legendary enchantment served as another commander, essentially, and acted in the same ways as a commander. So you can kind of have two commanders sort of partner, but one's a legendary enchantment, and it can only be paired with certain commanders. I think this is a cool change to EDH, but I do think adding multiple colors to commanders, I think ruins some of the deck building limitations that makes Commander really fun. And having even more cards you can cast for free sort of ruins the point of a singleton format. Yeah. And having more cards that you have access to and you can count on having access to every single game, like a commander or a partner or a background, sort of ruins the point of having a singleton format and every game being so different from each other. But that's just what I seek out of Commander, and that's likely very different from other people. In 13th, I have Ravenous from Warhammer 40k. Ravenous have an additional cost that is normally X, and they enter with X +1/+1 counters on them. And if X is 5 or more, they get to draw a card. I really like mechanics, and we're going to see this in the future as well. I really like mechanics that are good early and late, right? So these are paired with creatures that you can just cast early, and it's fine. Or you can cast late for a lot, and it does an additional thing if it's in the deep late game. And I like that about Ravenous. The issue is that while there's incentive to wait to draw a card, it scales as the game goes on. So you're probably just going to cast it whenever you have it. And there's likely not a lot of decisions that go into just waiting until I can draw a card. And I won't cast anything this turn because it's really important that I get Ravenous. You're just going to cast the card in your hand, and it's really neat when it gets Ravenous. And so in that sense, My 12th favorite mechanic out of this past year is shield counters, which came out of New Capenna. So this is a little bit better than stun counters because I could see actually wanting shield counters. Basically, whenever a creature would be destroyed or damage would be dealt to a creature, prevent that and remove a shield counter. The reason it's so far down on the list, though, is that you can kind of stop it by just like dealing 1 damage to the thing, like making it get in combat where the creature wouldn't die anyway and the shield counter just goes away and then you can actually kill it. So shield counters are a lot less powerful than they might seem on the surface, especially the playable creatures that have shield counters are already pretty difficult to kill, especially kill with value like Titan of Industry. And it's another reason why it's so high on the list compared to stun counters is this is sort of a new thing being added to the game rather than stun counters just being this thing that is put into the game to give a visual representation of things that already happen in the game. Shield counters are actually new and a little interesting. Blitz from New Capenna is my 11th favorite mechanic released. Basically, you can cast a spell for a alternate cost, the Blitz cost, and it gains haste, and when it dies, draw a card, and you sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. So this is really cool because it adds decision-making to the game. You can basically cycle a creature, like this is how I read it. You cycle a creature to be able to get in there for damage, and you get to draw a card on your end step. So it's kind of like cycling with extra steps and just a little bit better, which I really, really like. Also, the best Blitz card, Tenacious Underdog, you can do it from the graveyard, so it can keep coming back, which is wild. And so deciding if you want a permanent on the battlefield versus like getting in for combat once and cycling is a very cool mechanic added to the game. My 10th favorite mechanic is Modified, which was originally released in Neon Dynasty. There are extra things on some cards that if this creature is modified or if another creature is modified or for every other modified creature, something happens. So they're just adding a keyword to something that is already going on in the game. And Modified is like if an equipment is on it, if an aura is on it, if there are counters on it, like that includes shield counters, stun counters, +1/+1 counters, anything on it, it is considered modified. And so even though this is kind of like stun counters where it's just a visual representation of like something's happening in the game or they're just adding a keyword to something that's already happening in the game, what I like about being modified is if you plan on playing modified cards, it sort of gives a deck building constraint and it makes you build a deck differently so the cards with like modified something do something a little bit more powerful. And I really like the idea of having to build your deck around something rather than just throwing cards into a deck that are either aggressive, mid-range, or control. My 9th favorite mechanic is Squad, Warhammer 40k. Basically, you can have an additional cost to cast a spell, and you can pay the cost any number of times, sort of like multi-kicker. And when it enters the battlefield, you create that many tokens that are copies of it. So it's like a restricted multi-kicker, creating tokens that are copies of it. I really like this because it's fun to play with cards that are both good early and late. I hate awful top decks in the late game, and I hate drawing my end game cards early in the game. Things with Squad, you can either cast early or be able to like create 4 or 5 of them in the late game. And I think that's a really, really fun way to play Magic. My 8th favorite mechanic is Power Stones. Which some things make a thing called Power Stones, which are just token artifacts that you can tap for 1 colorless mana, and that colorless mana can't be spent on non-artifact spells. I think it's really cool because while you can't spend it on non-artifact spells, you can use it to activate abilities, you can use it to pay for things like Mana Leak or whatever Mana Leak-like effects, or cast artifacts. And there's a lot of cards that create Power Stones that do other really relevant things. In fact, in Standard right now, there's a really cool Is It Ramp deck. Yes, Is It Ramp, no green, that plays a bunch of like blue and red control cards that just magically make Power Stones as well. And you ramp that into like big, nasty artifacts. And that is a powerful thing to do. And so when you're tacking on a relevant thing onto cards you already want to play, I think they did the Power Stone mechanic really, really well. And that's why it's my 8th favorite. My 7th favorite mechanic is from Dominaria United. It is Enlist. Enlist says, as a creature attacks, you may tap a non-attacking creature you control without summoning sickness. When you do, add its power to the creatures until end of turn. I like that it's without summoning sickness because it doesn't just read as haste, sort of like vehicles read as haste when they were first released. You actually have to make decisions if you want to attack with 1 less creature and pump up a creature. And it turns cards that wouldn't necessarily be good on the battlefield to like pretty okay. And you have to make a trade-off when you make these decisions. And I think it leads to some really, really cool decision making within games and can lead to blowouts on the other side, right? If you're playing against an Enlist creature and you set up a board state that makes it difficult for them to attack without Enlist, but you have a removal spell up, it creates cool, interesting interactions on either side of the battlefield. This is mostly in limited. There aren't that many good Enlist creatures in constructed, but every time I've played it, it has been very fun. My 6th most favorite mechanic is Reconfigure, which was released in Neon Dynasty. You can pay it's a creature with a cost, with a Reconfigure cost, where you can attach the creature to another creature like an equipment. And when it's attached, it is not a creature. So these are basically creature equipments, like in all honesty. But having something that can turn into something else in certain parts of the game, I think is very cool. And again, adds to really fun decision making, especially since it's also considered an equipment, the Reconfigure cards. So things that search out equipment, you can search out a creature. So there's like multiple avenues that this is really, really cool in. Fifth favorite mechanic is Casualty, which was released in New Capenna. Basically, it has Casualty and then a number, and you sacrifice a creature of that power or greater, of the numbered power or greater, and you can copy the spell. There's a bunch of really cool cards that do this. One's a counter spell that you have that, so you can copy the counter spell. There's a Planeswalker, not a Mixilus, that does this, where you Casualty X, where you can do it as many times as you want. So you can do it with as high power as you want. It enters with the loyalty counters of that ability. And I think it's really cool because you can cash in on creatures that you don't want. Or again, it leads to really fun decision making where you get to decide if this spell is more important than a permanent that is already on the battlefield, and maybe even lead to deck building constraints where if you want to play this Casualty card that is really, really good, if you Casualty with it, like the Obnixilis, you need to make sure that you play creatures that you're totally okay with sacking so that you can play the card in its like best form. My fourth favorite mechanic released this year is Prototype from the Brothers War. Basically, you can cast a spell for a different mana cost. This different mana cost makes it the new colored mana. These are normally on colorless artifacts. You can cast it for something with colored mana. When you cast it for something with that colored mana, the card becomes that color and has a different power and toughness, but has all the other abilities on the card. And again, something that is good early, where you cast something for the Prototype, and good late, where you cast something without the Prototype. I love mechanics like this. I can put cards on my deck where I don't feel bad about drawing it early, and I don't feel bad about top decking it late, which is amazing. My third favorite mechanic is Read Ahead from Dominaria United. Basically, when you play sagas, there are 3 chapters on a saga. Previously, before Dominaria United, you had to play a saga, go from the first chapter, second chapter, third chapter, sacrifice it. With Read Ahead, you can start on any chapter. So if you want to jump right to the third chapter and sacrifice it immediately, you can do that. If you want to start in the second chapter and then do the third chapter, you can do that. The reason I like Read Ahead so much is Read Ahead allows you to make really deep decisions of if you want full value out of this card, you start on chapter 1. If you don't want full value out of this card and you want to use it as kind of like a triple face card that you can cast any part of it, you can start in chapter 2 or chapter 3, but you get less total value out of the card. And those like value versus like necessity decision making makes for some really fun games of Magic. My second favorite mechanic introduced this year is from New Capenna, is Connive. Connive is something happens that it makes you connive, some like a Ledger Shredder, the second spell that is cast every turn makes you connive, where you draw a certain amount of cards, or normally 1, but sometimes more, and then discard that same amount of cards. And for every non-land card that you discard, you put a +1/+1 counter on the creature. Now, Connive is really cool because it's always good, right? You always want to trigger it because you just kind of filter out and keep the best cards in your hand. And then you get rewarded for discarding cards that actually do stuff. So it's a mechanic that always feels good to do. And it's a mechanic that when you do it, you have to kind of make a decision. Do you want a bigger creature, or do you want to keep stuff that you want? Or do you want to keep stuff that does stuff? Or even early in the game, you're kind of rewarded for just doing it at all. If you like need to make sure you hit your land drops, you discard the non-lands, which you want the lands anyway. It's really, really fun to play with and makes it so you just like have powerful stuff in your hand all the time. And I love that. My favorite mechanic released this year is from Baldur's Gate, and it is Initiative. And this might be a kind of a hot topic as far as like it being people's favorite mechanic because it is currently dominating Legacy. Some people might say it's making Legacy unfun. Initiative is. But basically, whenever you play a card with Initiative, or you take the initiative, or you deal damage to an opponent with the initiative, you get the initiative, and then you venture into the Undercity, which is a dungeon. And at the beginning of every upkeep, you also get to venture into the Undercity if you have the initiative. And as you go through the Undercity, it does some really powerful things that you can see here. And so the idea is you play something with the initiative, and then you make sure that your opponent can't deal combat damage to you. And then the game becomes about dealing combat damage to your opponent. Now, some people might say this is bad because it sort of changes the rules of the game and sort of changes the goals of the game. And it makes both decks play in the initiative decks like terms. I think it's really fun. It sort of adds a sub game to the game where like you get rewarded for dealing combat damage. So like, let's deal combat damage. And like, it totally changes the pace of play and how people have to play the game while still working on their own strategy. I think it's really cool for both players, even the non-initiative player. And anything that makes it feel like a fresh, different game than a normal game of Magic, I love. And I think initiative is the only mechanic that did that for me this year, though the legacy deck needs to catch a ban in some fashion. If you like this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. Check me out on social medias. Links are above me and in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.